I want to talk to you guys about Ukraine's far right. Whether or not Ukraine has a Nazi problem has been a big point of discussion. It's been talked about for years, but really it accelerated itself after Russia invaded Ukraine for obvious reasons. Putin said that Ukraine has a Nazi problem and that he's going to denazify the country. This, of course, got a lot of people talking about whether or not Ukraine does indeed have a Nazi problem. A lot of people, especially online, argue that Ukraine doesn't have a Nazi problem, and this is all just Russian propaganda. And they will always bring up the same arguments. Ukraine doesn't have a Nazi problem given the fact that the Ukrainian president is Jewish. And indeed, Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish. But at the same time, Volodymyr Zelensky will call major Ukrainian historical figures who collaborated with the Nazis heroes. He will describe them as heroes. He will describe Stepan Bandera as a hero.
Степан Бендера – герой для какого-то процента украинцев. И это нормально, и это классно. Это один из тех людей, который защищал свободу Украины. Да.
On top of this, amongst the most popular historical figures in Ukraine are Andrei Melnik and Roman Shukovich. Andrei Melnik was one of the orchestrators of the genocide of the Polish people in regions like East Galicia, Lvov, Volyn. It is a fact that Roman Shukovich was not only a Nazi collaborator, but he was also one of the orchestrators of the massacre of Polish people and Jewish people. It is a fact that Stepan Bandera was the leader, or one of the leaders, of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which butchered Jews and Polish people. What this tells me is that Ukraine has a far-right population, substantial enough that the Jewish president has to kowtow to this far-right presence, has to kowtow to the nationalism that is very strong in Ukraine, to the point that he's calling Nazi collaborators heroes. And of course, people are going to sit there and argue, well, Zelensky only praised Bandera. He hasn't said anything nice about Shukovich or Melnik. When you call Bandera a hero, you are calling him a hero in his capacity as a leader of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which butchered Poles and Jews. And so by praising Bandera, you are also, by extension, giving a positive opinion to his organization. You cannot detach Bandera from the organization that he led, because what provided Bandera power was the crowd that followed him, and the crowd that followed him were members of the OUN. Now, people will say, well, is it Nazism, right? Does Ukraine have a Nazi problem? There are definitely people in Ukraine who are Nazis. There are definitely people in the Ukrainian military who are Nazis and who will hold up the swastika. But a lot of people in Ukraine will say that they're not really Nazis. They're simply just nationalists. Okay, fair enough. They're nationalists. And they will say, we are nationalists, and our heroes are members of the UPA and the OUN, and they fought the Nazis, right? These Ukrainian nationalists back in World War II fought the Nazis and the Soviets at the same time. So we're not Nazis because we revere people who fought the Nazis. Okay, fair enough. That doesn't change the fact that you revere people who were mass murderers and Nazi collaborators. Well, they were Nazi collaborators, but just to the extent of collaborating with them to fight against the Soviet invaders. They weren't really Nazis. Okay, fine, but they were still mass murderers who wanted to remove, ethnically cleanse the Polish population. So maybe you're not Nazis in the most explicit sense of the word, but at the same time, you are ultra-nationalists. So what I would say is that Ukraine has a ultra-nationalist problem. People like to use the word Nazi, but the thing about using this word is that the opposition can easily say, well, no, because most people in Ukraine will say that, they're not going to hold up the swastika. They're not revering Adolf Hitler. So what I would say is that a more effective explanation of this is to simply say that Ukraine has an ultranationalist problem, or really a far right problem. Because at the same time, okay, fine, let's say most people aren't holding up swastikas, most people aren't revering Hitler, but at the same time, most people in Ukraine will express reverence for these historical figures who were indeed murderers, who were indeed evil people, who led organizations like the OUN, like the UPA, which were mass murdering paramilitaries who did indeed collaborate with the Nazis. There is an argument regarding Stepan Bandera that he took no part in the slaughter of Poles and Jews, and that he was in jail. This is a very common argument that is utilized by today's Ukrainian nationalist and apologist for Ukrainian nationalism. They will say that Bandera was in prison. He was imprisoned by the Nazis. So they'll use this as a way to argue that Bandera was actually anti-fascist or anti-Nazi because, hey, the Nazis put him in prison. The only reason why the Nazis put Bandera in prison was because he made a declaration of Ukrainian independence in 1941. He declared Ukrainian independence, and he said that Ukraine is an independent country. And he did this with the confidence that the Germans were going to back the formation of an independent Ukraine. One of the things that inspired the Ukrainian nationalists to do this was Croatia. It's very interesting how Croatian nationalism will sort of interact with Ukrainian nationalism. We see this even today, where you have Croatian far-right fighters in Ukraine fighting against the Russians. I remember seeing in the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine how all these Croat far-right fighters were traveling to Ukraine to fight the Russians. This is most definitely a part of it's most definitely connected to the history of Croatia in the Second World War, where you had far-right Croats, members of the Ustasha paramilitary organization, joining the Nazis to fight against the Serbs, and the Ustasha would eventually slaughter around 1 million people, most of whom were ethnic Serbs, who the Croats wanted to ethnically cleanse. But when the Germans invaded Croatia, they talked about the Croats wanted the Germans to help them form an independent Croatia. Now, the Germans were heavily against the idea of forming an independent state under their watch. The Germans were an empire at this time. They wanted to control countries. They didn't want to give countries any sort of independence because that would be counter to the idea of empire. Why would you as an empire conquer a country only to make it independent? So, of course, the Germans didn't want to make any one of its territories independent. But what they did with the Croats was they gave them lots of autonomy. So while Croatia was under the Third Reich, Croatia had a lot of autonomy. It had some freedoms. In fact, I read that Croatia had more autonomy than any other Nazi-occupied territory. So the Ukrainians saw this and they said, look, the Croatians have been given independence. Well, they really didn't have independence because they were still under the control of the Third Reich. In fact, the Nazis would use Croats for free labor, slave labor, literally slave labor. They were taking lots and lots of Croats, shipping them to Germany to be laborers. So the Germans weren't giving the Croats independence. They were controlling Croatia and using the people of Croatia as slaves. And they were also using Croats as proxy fighters against the Serbs. But the Ustasha was so brutal against the Serbs that even the Germans were disturbed by the type of horror inflicted upon the Serbs by the Croatian far right. But nonetheless, Mr. Bandera was so empowered by the Germans expanding into Eastern Europe that when the Germans arrived in Ukraine, Mr. Bandera said, "Okay, now I'm going to make the declaration of Ukrainian independence." The Germans didn't want this because they saw the Slavs as nothing more than slaves. They didn't want any sort of independent Slavic country. But this didn't stop Bandera. He declared his allegiance to the Führer, and he declared an independent Ukraine. And he made this declaration in 1941. In July of 1941, he was arrested. Now, he was arrested, and this is where the argument comes, because they'll say that, well, Mr. Bandera was put in prison by the Germans, therefore all these killings that were done by Ukrainian nationalists are not his fault because he was in prison. Well, he was under arrest in July 5th, 1941, but from July 1st to July 3rd of 1941, the OUN were committing massacres of Jews. There is a quote that I want to read to you guys from an historian by the name of Sol Friedman. He said, during the first 3 days of July 1941, the Nachtigall Battalion, this is a Nazi battalion that consisted of Ukrainian nationalists. These were Ukrainian nationalists who were part of Bandera's organization, the OUN. And it says here that it composed almost entirely of Ukrainians under the direction of the Gestapo, slaughtered 7,000 Jews in the vicinity of Lvov. Before their execution, Jewish professors, lawyers, and doctors were made to lick all the steps of 4-story buildings and to carry garbage in their mouths from house to house, then forced to run a gauntlet of men wearing blue and gold armbands, coincidentally the colors of the Petlurist Republic. They were bayoneted to death in what was officially termed Action Petlura. So just days before Bandera was arrested, this is what his people were doing. They were butchering Jews. They were also butchering Poles. In fact, before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, in 1940 and 1941, the OUN were already butchering Poles and Jews. They were already butchering thousands of Poles and Jews, in fact. They were butchering people in East Galicia. And it's very interesting that Bandera visited Eastern Galicia when these killings were taking place. So to sit there and say, well, Bandera was in jail. He was in jail, so he was innocent. Well, he literally visited East Galicia at the same time when his people were butchering Jews and Poles in that area. He visited that area when the killing was happening in that particular area. So how the hell could you say that? He had nothing to do with it. Before he was arrested, before he was put in jail on July 5th, 1941, in the first 3 days of July, his people butchered thousands of Jews. So, obviously, he was a part of this. Now, before the Germans came to Poland, before they invaded Poland, the Polish government had put Bandera in prison. This was in June of 1934. Why? Because, he was already in prison then, but there was a reason why the Poles arrested him. Bandera was arrested because he was a subversive figure. And Bandera was someone who truly believed in the effectiveness of political assassinations. He believed in assassinating Polish officials. His organization, the OUN, assassinated Polish officials. So years before the massacre of the Poles in Volhynia and East Galicia, the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was already a terrorist organization. And the Polish government knew this, and this is why they put Bandera in prison. He was found guilty of organizing the assassination of a high-ranking Polish official. This was Poland's interior minister. His name was Bronisław Pieraki. It was confirmed that Bandera was behind the assassination. He didn't physically gun down this official. The actual gunman was Hirhori Matseko. Some of these Ukrainian names sound, oddly enough, Japanese, which is fascinating. But Matseko was the one who gunned down Bronisław Pieraki. But the mind behind the assassination, or at least one of the main minds behind the assassination, was Stepan Bandera. So Bandera was already a murderer. He was already a terrorist. And that's why the Polish government put him in prison. Now, when the Germans invaded Poland, all of a sudden, he was out of prison. Why? It's obvious why. Because the Nazis wanted him out. The Nazis wanted to use people like Bandera, like Melnik, like Shupkevich, Roman Shupkevich. They wanted to use these guys as leaders so that they could use the Ukrainians as violent proxies against the Poles and the Jews. This is what the Germans did. They would invade a country and they would say, okay, who are the far-right lunatics that we can use as proxies? They did this in Lithuania. They did this in Belarus. They did this in Ukraine. They did this in Croatia. They did this in Bosnia. Hell, they even recruited Muslims. They worked with Palestinians. They worked with Arabs. They worked with anyone who was willing enough, who was far-right enough to work with the Nazis. So this whole idea of Bandera being, this innocent man that was just fighting for his country and, he was just put in prison because he was anti-fascist. Well, that's a bunch of nonsense. The fact is that he was put in prison before the Germans invaded Poland. He was put in prison by the Polish government because he was a terrorist. Then the Germans invaded Poland. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, he's out of prison. What's he doing? He's leading the OUN. The OUN is butchering Jews and Poles by the thousands before he's even put in prison. And they say he had nothing to do with it. That's a bunch of nonsense. You're running an organization. You're running a paramilitary organization. This organization is killing thousands of people. You are responsible. Bottom line. This is why the Poles to this day will tell you Bandera was a mass murderer. And they're right. Melnik, Lebed, Mikola Lebed was another Nazi collaborator who was the main orchestrator, the main mind behind the planning of the slaughter of the Poles in Volhynia in the 1940s, early 1940s. And Bandera said that his mission, his vision of a free Ukraine will have to require the sacrifice of thousands of lives in order to be fulfilled. This is what he said. That would mean killing people for your cause. This is why he didn't mind committing acts of terrorism. This is why he didn't mind assassinating Polish officials. This was not a good person. In fact, Bandera was a scumbag. He was a complete scumbag. After the war, he would eventually flee to Austria, and then he would eventually go to Munich, and he would basically become a Cold War agent. During the Cold War, and this is something that disturbs me to no end. I've been talking about this since 2016, 17. During the Cold War, there was something called Operation Gladio, where Western intelligence agencies like the CIA, MI5, German intelligence, etc., Italian intelligence, worked with far-right operatives, neo-Nazis, ultranationalists, neo-fascists, etc., in order to form paramilitary organizations to fight against the Soviet Union. Supposedly, the CIA and other NATO intelligence agencies were planning on defending Europe from a Soviet invasion. And they would defend Europe by simply arming and training these far-right paramilitaries, so that if the Soviets were ever to invade Europe, these paramilitaries would be there, what they called stay-behinds, to fight the Soviets. Part of Operation Gladio was propaganda, creating propaganda, part of really, this goes really beyond Gladio, part of the Cold War policy was to whitewash the realities of Ukrainian nationalism. This was another example of this was Japan. Together, Japan and America together began to whitewash the realities of Japanese war crimes. Why? Because the Americans wanted to give a better image to the Japanese so that it wouldn't look that bad for the Americans to work with the Japanese against the Chinese, against China. So during the Cold War, Bandera basically became an operative for Western intelligence agencies. And so he had bodyguards. And he tried to rape, I believe, I actually wrote this down. He tried to rape, I want to say it was the wife or the sister of one of his bodyguards. It was the bodyguard's wife. He attempted to rape his bodyguard's wife. And he even forbade his own children from talking with Polish, Russian, or Jewish children. So he told his kids, don't talk to them Polish kids, don't talk to them Jewish kids, don't talk to them Russian kids, they're not pure. And he was also a rapist. What's interesting is that members of the OUN were also rapists. They raped Polish women. They were huge rapists. They were murderers and rapists. And Bandera was a rapist. So Bandera, he reflected his own followers and vice versa. His followers reflected him. These were not good people. These were scumbags. This whole idea that, they were just wonderful patriots. No, they were scumbags. They were fighting the Soviets, but they themselves wanted power. And the things that they were willing to do to establish that power was pretty freaking horrendous and atrocious. Genocide is, rape, pretty atrocious. That goes without saying. What's disturbing about the whole Cold War policy is that America didn't mind helping murderers, working with murderers like Bandera. In fact, the mastermind behind the Volhynia massacre, in which tens of thousands of Poles were murdered, was Mykola Lebed. After the Second World War, Lebed would become a Cold War operative, and he was buried here in the United States. That's right. Here in America, we have the gravestone for a mass murderer who was working with our government. It's pretty sad. After the Second World War, these OUN operatives, these OUN leaders, they would go to the United States, they would go to Europe, they would go to Canada. In fact, a number of OUNB members, OUNB being the OUN faction that was ran by Mr. Bandera, OUNB members obtained positions at Rutgers University in New Jersey. They also got positions at McMaster University and the University of Alberta in Canada. So many Ukrainian Nazis went to Canada, and they're still there. So that's the reality of Bandera. Bandera ran the OUN. He was the leader of the OUN. The OUN was already butchering people by the thousands in 1941, 1942. In East Galicia. He went to East Galicia when these killings were taking place in that region, and he didn't say anything against it. When the Germans had him in prison, it's not like they put him in this dirty cell, which was the case for a lot of political prisoners. He was put in a very nice house that had a kitchen, a nice bed. And while the Poles were being butchered, he was still communicating with the OUN. He was communicating with his own organization through his wife. Why didn't he say, stop the killing? Why didn't he order them to stop? He didn't. After the Second World War, Bandera tried to clean his image. Him and other Ukrainian operatives that he worked with in his network try to clean up the image of the OUN. In fact, in 1943, the OUN began talking about the importance of democracy. Well, why would they talk about the importance of democracy? Because at this point in the war, the Ukrainians already got the idea that the Germans were going to lose. They already got the idea that the Germans were going to lose, so they began to discuss the importance of democracy. Because they saw the writing on the wall. They said, the Germans are losing, the Americans are going to win. The Americans love talking about democracy, so we better adapt. See, that's the thing about the Ukrainians that I want to, this is one of the points that I want to get across, is that, does Ukraine have a Nazi problem? I much prefer to say that Ukraine has a nationalist problem. It's an ultra-nationalist, far-right problem. Because yes, while Ukraine does have historical heroes that it loves who were Nazi collaborators, these guys like Melnik and Bandera and Shukovich, these guys were collaborators only in the sense that they wanted to use the Nazis to fight the Soviets. They simply wanted to use the Nazis, and the Nazis wanted to use them. But when they saw the Germans losing, they didn't mind kissing up to the Americans and utilizing the very lingo that would tickle the ears of the Americans. So they were opportunists. Their own ideology was one of Ukrainian supremacy and ultranationalism. So does Ukraine have a Nazi problem? They are Nazis in Ukraine. I would much prefer to say that it has an ultranationalist problem that reverences these heroes. And I think if people who are critical of Ukraine want to engage better and more effectively in this discourse, I think it's more effective if they say ultranationalist far-right problem, not Nazi. That way, if someone says, well, I don't see a lot of people holding swastikas, you guys can simply bypass this sort of argument, and you guys can say, well, yes, but how many Ukrainians are willing to condemn these national heroes? How many Ukrainians revere these national heroes and follow this ideology and revere the UPA and revere the Ukrainian or the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, and revere Bandera and Melnik and Shukovich? They still revere these people. Yes, they're not saying Sieg Heil Hitler, but they're saying Sieg Heil Shukovich and Melnik and Bandera, and that is a problem. And I think that is more effective because Ukraine definitely has a very strong presence of these types of people. And I think this is where the danger lies in regards to Ukrainian nationalism. And, the OUN, they begin talking about democracy and all these things to appease to the Americans. And this began in 1943. But what else was happening in 1943? The mass slaughter of Polish people, which went on from 1943 all the way to 1945. They say, oh, well, Bandera was in prison. Yes, he was in prison, but he was still in communication with the OUN. He was still in communication with the OUN. So what this tells me is that Bandera was in on it. Even the historian who has written so much on Bandera, Rosalinsky-Liebe, he himself says there really is no evidence that shows that Bandera was against the killing. Now, to be fair, he also says that there's no evidence that Bandera vocally supported the mass murder of Poles. But at the same time, actions speak louder than words. And many times, the absence of action speaks louder than words, because an absence of action is also an action unto itself. If you're running this organization and literally they're murdering people, and you're in communication with them, and you're not doing anything, you're not going out of your way to stop this, because before Bandera was put in prison by the Germans, and after, the killing was happening. Even before he was put in prison by the Germans, the killing was happening, everybody. So Bandera most definitely shares a responsibility in the killings that his organization was doing. The Nightingale, which consisted of members of the OUN, it's all there. It's all there. And these people, Bandera, Shukovich, Melnik, these national heroes, they are still enshrined as heroes in Ukraine, to the point where even the Jewish president of Ukraine is saying that they're heroes. Now, what kind of a country is this where a Jewish political leader who's holding the highest office of that country is himself calling mass murderers, people who were involved in the killings of Jews, heroes. That, my friend, is a country that has a huge problem. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.